Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are undertaking a pretty critical mission, I think. We're going to try and cut through the relentless noise of
Yeah.
Washington political spectacle,
hmm
and we're going to analyze a single, very recent power move by Donald Trump.
Hmm.
Now, the sources we've gathered, and it's a dense stack, political analysis, economic reports, social commentary, they all claim this isn't just another flare-up.
Not at all. It's not just drama.
Right. They suggest it's a strategic maneuver,
Mm.
and it was executed with a kind of precision designed to fundamentally rewrite the rules of power,
Mm.
and maybe even America's economic and social trajectory for the next decade.
It is absolutely essential to look past the personalities here. I mean, that's the first thing. What we're really seeing is, you could call it a declaration of intent.
A declaration of intent. I like that.
Yeah, this move, it operates as a massive signal flare. And it's not just for the upcoming campaign cycle, but for how a potential administration might actually govern. The underlying message is all about leverage and control. It's far more than it is about any one person or a specific controversy.
And here's why this matters directly to you, the listener. And it doesn't matter if you lean left, right, or, straight down the middle. Our sources are all suggesting that the political and economic volatility that comes out of this, well, it could touch everything fundamental in your life.
Everything.
We're talking about the current stability of the housing market, the long-term outlook for your job security, and maybe most critically, the long-term viability of your retirement planning.
Which is terrifying for a lot of people.
It is. So this is not some abstract game that's being played inside the Beltway.
Yeah.
It is intensely personal. It affects the very bedrock of your financial security.
That's the key distinction we need to make today. When a political figure with this level of influence executes such an aggressive move, it's never just about pulling numbers or winning the next debate.
Right.
It's about shifting the tectonic plates beneath the whole economic and social system. We are diving deep beneath the surface level headlines today to trace that hidden chain reaction that, the political and financial class in Washington are already starting to process, even if they won't publicly admit the sheer scale of the change.
That framing is perfect
Mm-hmm.
because we spend so much time watching the immediate political theater, the tweets, the controversies, the sound bites,
Mm-hmm.
and we often miss the fact that this theater is often just masking these much larger foundational economic and social shifts that are happening right out in the open. So let's start there. Let's unpack this political strategy first and maybe examine the sheer level of loyalty that's now being demanded.
Okay, so the anchor point for this entire analysis is a very public, very calculated drawing of a line in the sand. And it was deliberately executed in a high-stakes, high-visibility environment.
Where did this happen?
The analysis tracks this to Trump speaking to reporters aboard Air Force One recently.
Wow, okay. So on Air Force One, the symbolism there is pretty heavy.
It's the ultimate symbol of executive power and movement, right?
Yeah.
So it lends the action this immediate weight. You don't just say something like this anywhere. You say it there for maximum impact.
So the scene is set. Cameras are rolling, reporters are all clustered around, and he makes a statement that forces every single political insider, from D.C. all the way down to local state houses, to instantly recalibrate.
Instantly.
And this wasn't just a criticism, was it? It was more like an official public shunning of someone who, up until then, had been the very definition of loyalty.
The Congresswoman in question, Marjorie Taylor Greene, or MPG, she had been one of his most unwavering, loudest public defenders. She was a fixture at rallies, but
There's a but.
there's a but. In the recent past, she had begun showing what they saw as dangerous signs of operating independently. The sources point to 3 specific areas that constituted a profound break in discipline.
Okay, what were they?
First, appearing on liberal news networks without coordinating her message. That's a big no-no. Second, she was openly questioning the administration's traditional focus on foreign policy aid, particularly Ukraine.
Which is a pretty core tenet of the movement at this
A
point.
very core tenet.
Yeah.
And third, and this is a procedural one, but it matters, siding with Democrats on a few high-profile procedural votes in the House.
Okay, so those kinds of internal disagreements, you'd think they're common in any coalition, even among allies. But the source suggests it wasn't the policy disagreements themselves that were fatal, was it? It was something else.
Exactly. It was the lack of subservience to the messaging structure. That's the key. The system is designed to tolerate minor policy differences. I mean, that's politics. But it absolutely cannot tolerate decentralized power or messaging.
So you can disagree behind closed doors, but when you're out in public, you toe the
You
line.
toe the line. And the analysis indicates the final, undeniable act of disloyalty. The thing that made a public confrontation completely unavoidable was her decision to post a screenshot.
The screenshot of what?
A private text exchange she had with Trump. This happened after he had already pulled his endorsement for her.
Wait. So she deliberately made a private conversation public to what? To try and defend her position against him?
Yes, that single act, making a private conversation public, was viewed as a profound violation of trust. And critically, it was seen as an attempt to use his own words and his attention to gain leverage against him.
That's a huge move.
It is. It signaled that she saw herself as a co-equal player, someone capable of challenging his political authority using the very tools he provided her.
And the response, delivered while airborne on the ultimate symbol of presidential authority, was, well, it was immediate and undeniably punitive.
Aboard Air Force One, Trump made the political divorce official. He didn't just criticize her, he mocked her. He started referring to her publicly as Marjorie Taylor Brown, stating she had moved too far left. Brown. And he made it explicit that she was officially out of the Maggie movement. And the sources emphasized that the immediate practical consequence was the real lesson here for everyone else watching. Before that plane even landed, challengers in Georgia were already lining up. They were sending public signals that they were prepared to launch primary campaigns against her.
Before the plane landed. Okay, let's pause here, because this is important. Let's unpack the true strategic importance. The core finding here, according to this deep dive analysis, is that this entire very public spectacle was never really about MTG at all, was it?
Not at all. It was a spectacular, high-stakes warning shot fired across the bow of every other Republican in Congress.
It was a demonstration.
It was a demonstration of absolute unconditional power. So when you control a political movement, and a movement is a dynamic, energized base that's distinct from the formal Republican Party, structural loyalty isn't just preferred, it is the absolute currency of survival.
So it's not about being a Republican, it's about being loyal to the movement's leader.
Precisely. Trump used this incident to remind everyone that he still controls the political energy, the primary challengers, and the media narrative that can make or break an incumbent literally overnight. This power doesn't flow from the party establishment or from think tanks or from the traditional donors. It flows from his direct connection to the base.
And what makes this a truly, a masterful strategic maneuver, according to the sources, is the timing. This highly disruptive public political divorce happened while he was simultaneously executing a massive and totally unrelated pivot.
Yes.
A pivot designed to redefine his immediate political vulnerability.
The coordination was surgical. At the exact same moment he was consolidating loyalty on the political right by punishing dissent, he was redirecting everyone's attention away from a potentially damaging counter-narrative.
And what was that?
It was the brewing scandal around the recent, and the source calls them weak, new Epstein file leaks, which were clearly intended to smear him and distract from his agenda.
Okay, so he's under fire from one side.
And he dismisses the entire narrative as a hoax. He pivots instantly to the issues he claimed actually mattered to the American people: affordability, the cost of living, and putting Americans first.
That is where the strategy moves from just politics to, it's almost psychological warfare. His critics thought they had him cornered, right? They're using scandal and distraction as their weapon, and he just refuses to play their game. He just changes the entire battlefield in milliseconds.
The source material offers this really great analogy that makes the strategy brilliantly clear.
Okay.
Imagine you're in a high-stakes meeting and someone tries to undermine you by bringing up minor past mistakes that force you onto the defensive.
Right, they're trying to control the conversation.
Exactly. You can waste all your time and energy defending those ancient mistakes, allowing them to control the discussion, or you can briefly acknowledge the noise and then immediately shift the focus to a much larger, more compelling vision of the future, your future plans, your solutions, your path forward.
So by doing the latter, you don't just defend yourself, you seize control. You set the terms of engagement. You control what the media and your opponents have to spend their next 48 hours reacting to.
That's the psychological effect of controlled chaos. He generates multiple pressure points all at once. Suddenly, Republicans are forced to immediately take a public loyalty test.
Are you with me or against me?
Right. Democrats, on the other hand, have to wonder if their standard strategy of weaponizing scandal is actually still effective, or if they're just generating background noise that he can easily brush aside.
And the media is stuck in the middle.
The mainstream media, caught right in the middle, has to decide which massive breaking story to cover, knowing that whichever path they choose, he has already planned 2 or 3 moves ahead of them.
This sounds, I mean, just describing it sounds exhausting. How does the analysis categorize this kind of intense, perpetual disruption?
It fits a recognized historical pattern that the sources label as creating disruption to gain leverage. It's a known tactic.
Explain that.
When you play by the traditional rules, you grant your opponents stable footing. But when you intentionally create chaos, you deprive them of that stability. It exhausts the opposition, it confuses the narrative, and critically, it forces everyone else to react on his timeline and his agenda rather than their own. And that, right there, is the definition of leverage in modern politics.
And just to circle back on that pivot for a second, when the source calls the Epstein file leaks weak, what exactly do they mean by that? What was the context they were trying to counter?
Well, the context was pure political opposition research. That's how the analyst frames it. The suggestion is that while, the release of the files served a public interest in terms of transparency for the victims,
Sure.
the timing was strategically chosen to maximize embarrassment for anyone associated with Epstein, including Trump.
Okay.
So the source suggests they were weak in the sense that they confirmed past, already known associations, but they failed to provide the kind of bombshell, incriminating near evidence that would be necessary to truly move the political needle.
So it wasn't a smoking gun.
Not at all. It was old news repackaged. And Trump's countermove was to instantly label the whole thing a manufactured hoax, something intended to stop him from focusing on what he calls kitchen table economic issues. He was refusing to allow the opposition to define the terms of the conversation based on old, recycled controversy.
Okay, so we've established the political mechanics, the chaos, the demand for loyalty, the strategic pivot. Now, we have to transition to why this strategy resonates so deeply with the American voter. Specifically with those who are approaching or are already in retirement. We're moving from the theater of Air Force One to the specific and often painful reality affecting your personal financial security.
The analysis provides a really powerful bridge here. It strongly argues that the success of this entire political strategy, it hinges completely on a very deep, widespread, and frankly, an entirely justifiable feeling of economic instability across the country.
So it's tapping into a real anxiety.
A very real anxiety. The bedrock promises of the post-war era. The belief that if you diligently worked hard, saved smart, and followed the established rules that security would be guaranteed, those systems are not just bending anymore. For an entire generation, they're fundamentally starting to crack and fail.
We need to get specific here because the emotional core of this political movement is rooted in concrete economic pain points that hit you, the listener, directly. Let's talk about the current economic reality. What are people facing?
Okay, let's start with housing. It's the cornerstone of middle-class wealth.
For generations, yeah.
We are seeing mortgage rates climbing to levels not witnessed in over a generation. And this isn't just because of general inflation. It's the direct result of the Federal Reserve's aggressive interest rate hikes that were designed to curb that very inflation.
So the cure is causing its own kind of pain.
A huge amount of pain. When the Fed raises the benchmark rate, it translates into exponentially higher borrowing costs for consumers like you. A house that, say, older generations bought decades ago with an affordable fixed-rate loan now requires young families to come up with enormous down payments and secure mortgages at rates that dramatically increase the monthly cost.
So you're paying more for less.
Exactly. It effectively shrinks the size of the house you can afford by half in some markets.
And the listener who has been diligently saving for retirement isn't immune to this, right? Even if their house is paid off, they're not safe.
Not at all. They look at their retirement accounts and, while the paper growth might look appealing, the real purchasing power of that money is being just eroded by inflation and market volatility.
Explain that. What's the technical reality there?
Well, much of the wealth you've accumulated in your 401k or your IRA is heavily reliant on market returns, right? But those paper gains are being offset by the rising cost of literally everything: goods, services, gas. And more critically, as you approach retirement, you often shift your portfolio towards fixed income assets like bonds or annuities because you're seeking stability.
Right. You want less risk.
But when interest rates are high and inflation is rampant, the value and the real return on those safe fixed income assets get hammered. So you have more dollars on paper, but those dollars buy dramatically less food, less healthcare, less travel. The stability that people plan their entire lives for has become a mirage.
And then you have the relentless rising costs in the sectors you can't avoid.
Exactly. The non-negotiable costs. We see these relentless increases in healthcare costs, which are often the single largest variable expense in retirement.
And they always go up.
Always. Insurance premiums, property taxes, they all keep rising faster than any measured inflation rate for general goods. Everything that underpins a stable retirement is relentlessly moving out of reach, except for that foundational sense of security that people work 30 or 40 years to achieve.
The source goes deeper than just the financial data, though.
Right.
It really tries to tap into the emotional core of this profound feeling of a broken social contract.
The pain here is existential. That's the word the analysis uses. It's the perception of a broken promise, and not a political one, but a social one. You worked for decades. You often sacrificed vacations, luxuries, personal time, because the system promised that this diligence would lead to a stable, comfortable retirement. Now, watching the value and the certainty of all that hard work just dissipate or shift due to these huge external forces beyond your control, it generates a feeling of profound betrayal.
A betrayal against who or what?
Against the entire system, against Washington, against Wall Street, and against the perceived elites who people feel engineered this situation for their own benefit.
So regardless of whether you individually support Trump or not, this is precisely the deep, often unspoken frustration that his messaging taps into with, surgical precision.
His political strategy is the voice saying what millions of people feel privately. The established rules are rigged, and the system is no longer working for regular folks who played by those rules.
And the analysis suggests that this moment is different.
It is. While many politicians attempt to utilize populist anger, the current moment, the specific volatile combination of high economic anxiety and political instability, is creating a resonance that is setting up something far larger than just the next election. It's positioning him as maybe the only voice willing to acknowledge that the system is fundamentally flawed and needs a radical reset.
Now, I have to introduce some friction here, even if that feeling is legitimate. How does the source address the argument that this instability is less about Washington and more about just huge global economic forces, like trade, the rise of China, things no one president can control?
That's a crucial point. And the analysts do acknowledge that globalism plays a massive role. They don't ignore it. However, they argue that the political failure was the perceived refusal of successive administrations, both Republican and Democrat, to cushion the blow for American workers who were directly harmed by those global forces.
So the problem wasn't globalization itself, but the lack of a plan for the people it left behind.
That's the argument. The political strategy focuses on assigning blame directly to the insiders and the establishment in Washington, who either championed free trade without any mitigation for the downsides, or who simply failed to protect the interests of their own citizens against these external economic shocks. The message is simple and powerful. Other countries protect their workers. Washington chose not to protect ours. So to understand the intended future strategy, we really have to look back at the pattern that was established during his first term. The sources suggest this is the foundational blueprint for the economic strategy of the next decade.
And this is where he perfected the use of disruption as a form of negotiation.
Yes. The tariffs in 2018 were the prime example of this controlled chaos, but in the economic sphere. It caused maximum panic and uncertainty at the time.
I remember that. The reaction from economists was not positive.
It was almost uniformly negative. When those broad-based tariffs were imposed, particularly targeting China, mainstream orthodox economists, they predicted immediate crashes, supply chain breakdowns, a global trade war that would harm American consumers the most.
Right.
It caused massive chaos in the financial markets, and the business media ran nonstop stories about the impending disaster.
But the sources suggest that the chaos wasn't the point, it was the mechanism, right?
Exactly. What was happening quietly behind that massive curtain of noise and disruption? Negotiations. But, and this is the key, they were negotiations on Trump's terms.
How so?
The disruption forced other major trading partners, China, Mexico, Canada, the EU, to the table in a way they would never have consented to under the traditional, polite diplomatic rule book. The tariffs were the leverage, not the end goal.
So you kick the table over to get their attention.
And it worked to an extent. They forced concessions on issues like intellectual property theft, market access, and trade imbalances that had been just intractable for decades. The short-term pain for specific sectors was deemed an acceptable cost for gaining that long-term strategic leverage.
So the lesson learned by his inner circle, and what's now being signaled for the future, is that if you don't disrupt the table, you're forced to eat whatever crumbs the establishment offers you.
That's the core philosophy. And look also at the border policies during that time.
Right, massive disruption there too.
Massive legal and cultural disruption, endless court battles, profound controversy. But the underlying effect was a fundamental shift in the Overton window, the range of ideas considered politically acceptable.
So it changed what was even possible to talk about.
It did. Discussions about immigration, border security funding, enforcement actions that were considered far outside the political mainstream before 2016, they became mandatory topics of debate afterward, even for his opponents. He set the terms of the conversation.
And this recent announcement, cutting an internal dissenter, dismissing a scandal, and pivoting instantly to economic concerns, this signals that this disruption strategy is coming back. But it's centered squarely on economics this time.
That's right.
So what hints does the analysis provide about the actual economic blueprint being signaled? What would it look like?
The central theme is a kind of economic populism built around reclaiming lost sovereignty and leverage. The blueprint seems to hint at several major pillars. First, a forceful, policy-backed return to domestic manufacturing, particularly in critical sectors like pharmaceuticals, chips, and rare earth minerals.
Things we realized we needed during the pandemic.
Precisely. Second, the explicit use of tariffs, but not as a permanent punishment, more as dynamic, variable negotiation tools designed to compel specific behaviors from foreign governments and multinational corporations.
And what's the primary behavior they want to compel?
Bringing production and the associated jobs back to America.
So this moves beyond simple protectionism, and it becomes more like strategic economic warfare. It's focused on confronting the long-term outsourcing of the U.S. economy.
That's a good way to put it. It's a confrontation with the idea that corporate loyalty is, by default, global. The new policy framework seems to want to force corporations to recognize that their access to the massive American consumer market comes with a non-negotiable responsibility to employ American workers and locate critical supply chains within the U.S. sphere of influence.
Now, this economic message resonates so deeply with you, the listener, because it taps into a very specific collective memory of economic trauma. Tell us more about the source's emphasis on the memory of the 1982 manufacturing collapse.
The sources spend a lot of time on this because they recognize that the feeling of betrayal associated with that collapse is a core source of political fuel today.
It's not ancient history for a lot of people.
Not at all. Think about what happened in that era. Millions of Americans, particularly in the industrial Midwest and parts of the South, watched factories that had employed their families for 3 generations suddenly close their doors.
And those jobs went overseas.
They moved production overseas to lower-wage markets almost overnight. This wasn't a slow decline. For many communities, it was an economic amputation.
And the workers with decades of specialized experience suddenly found their skills were obsolete in this new economy.
And that's the pain point. They were told the promise of free trade was that it would create cheaper goods for everyone and better, higher-skilled service jobs for them. But for a large segment of the population, those service jobs never materialized, or they paid significantly less. And while goods were cheaper, the community structure, the social fabric, the dignity of a reliable paycheck, all of that was destroyed.
So for them, free trade felt like a direct betrayal.
It felt like a government-sanctioned sacrifice of their community's security for the sake of global corporate profit.
And that deep economic resentment, the feeling of having been betrayed by the political class on both sides, that explains the enduring resonance of Trump's core promise.
It absolutely does. He is one of the few national figures who has consistently promised to actively try to reverse that trend, to rebuild what was lost, and most importantly, to explicitly punish those who facilitated the exodus of those jobs.
And this message has gained new weight recently.
Immense new weight. It's not just history anymore. The sources point out that the COVID-era supply chain failures, you remember, when we couldn't source basic medical equipment or even simple consumer goods, that taught the entire nation just how vulnerable you are when everything critical is manufactured somewhere else.
So by focusing his new pivot on domestic manufacturing and economic independence, he is aligning his strategy not just with this historical populist anger, but with a very recently learned high-stakes lesson about national security and national resilience.
Exactly. The political argument and the practical, real-world argument are finally merging into one powerful message, which then sets up the massive realignment we are now observing in Washington.
That brings us to a fascinating observation from the analysis. The strange, almost unnerving quiet that followed this aggressive, disruptive announcement. You would expect the media to be in a complete frenzy, right? And every political pundit to be loudly dissecting the MTG drama. Yet there was this relative silence from the powerful corners that usually dictate the political conversation. So why the hush?
The sources identify this silence not as apathy, but as a moment of profound recalculation.
Recalculation?
Yeah, the powerful insiders, we're talking congressional leadership, major political donors, legacy media executives, institutional experts, they are reading the metrics. They're looking at the polls, the economic indicators, and they are recognizing that their established narrative, the one that insisted that Trump was a diminishing, legally beleaguered force, well, it's simply not holding up under scrutiny.
This sounds less like politics and more like like a high-stakes corporate takeover attempt, where the management suddenly realizes the hostile bidder actually has the financing to pull it off.
That's the exact tension. The analyst uses a poker game metaphor, which I think is perfect.
Okay.
The insiders had heavily bet their reputation and their resources on the belief that Trump held a weak hand. They were betting that the weight of legal challenges and conventional disapproval would inevitably sink him.
And then he goes all in.
He starts playing aggressively, punishing dissenters, pivoting narratives, showing zero signs of backing down. And they have to pause. They realize maybe he's not bluffing. Maybe we fundamentally misread the table, the mood of the electorate, and the strength of the loyalty he commands.
And they realize a drastic change in their own strategy is required immediately before they lose everything.
Exactly. The silence is a political holding pattern. It's a deep strategic adjustment happening across Washington, born from the immediate realization of raw power.
It is. And the source asks this crucial, provocative question that I think defines this era. What happens to democracy when power stops bothering to hide behind polite, principled political language and just presents itself as raw positioning and leverage?
That is a deeply unsettling question.
It is. I mean, on one hand, you could argue it's a grim form of honesty. At least you know the goal is winning and control rather than some abstract principle you don't really believe in.
But the danger, as the source notes, is that it confirms the public's darkest suspicion, that all the lofty ideals we teach about public service and governance were perhaps just a convenient facade all along. It destroys the final pretense of decorum and a shared commitment to the rules of the game.
And the analysis points out that this use of morality as a weapon is a shared characteristic of both sides, making the lack of honesty a systemic problem, not a partisan one.
The analysis insists on a neutral assessment of this tactic, which is important. On the left, power moves are very often wrapped in the rhetoric of justice, equity, and protecting democracy. The strategic timing of the Epstein files release is a perfect case study.
Okay, so the claim is that they released the files for transparency and holding the powerful accountable, framing it as this noble act.
But the source dissects the timing of it. If it were solely about victim advocacy and transparency, why did it take years to push for this aggressive release, even during times when they controlled the relevant committees in Congress?
Right.
Instead, the analysts suggest what we often observe is a tactical use of information. You release documents that name and embarrass your political opponents, while potentially using every mechanism available, legal or informal, to redact or suppress details that might implicate powerful donors, affiliated media figures, or influential people on your own side.
So it becomes highly effective opposition research, but it's cloaked in a noble cover story.
Precisely. And the counter strategy from Trump, the pivot to economics, is essentially an equivalent tactical move from the other side.
How so?
He wraps his counter strategy in the language of economic relief, national security, and addressing the real needs of the forgotten worker. This is equally powerful emotionally, but the analysis is clear. This messaging is also strategically used to deflect from legitimate questions about his own past associations, his legal liabilities, or the disruptive nature of his actions.
So in effect, both sides are strategically weaponizing moral language justice versus jobs to gain leverage.
And the inevitable casualty of this continuous high-stakes moral warfare is the public's trust. Not just trust in one leader, but trust that any leader, any institution, or any media outlet is genuinely prioritizing the public good over raw political advantage.
This institutional breakdown is so much wider than just politics, though. Let's detail the institutions that the sources suggest have seen their public trust just plummet in the last decade or so.
The list is staggering. You can start with the traditional media. Years of partisan reporting have led to a majority of Americans just assuming they are being actively lied to or manipulated to serve a political narrative, not to be informed factually.
Okay, so the media. What's next?
The medical establishment and scientific experts, post-COVID, where you had mixed messaging, politically charged recommendations, perceived overreach, millions of people now question even basic public health guidance.
Right.
The financial system. Following the 2008 bailouts, the lack of accountability for Wall Street, and now the current inflation crisis, the belief that the system is fair to the average saver is effectively gone. Government itself, barely a quarter of Americans believe Washington works for them.
So all the big ones.
All of them. Even the traditional foundations of society like churches, universities, and local schools have seen their trust metrics crater. This is primarily due to perceptions that they have become vehicles for political and cultural activism rather than neutral centers of education or faith.
This pervasive collapse of trust, it fundamentally changes the job description of what it means to be a successful leader, doesn't it?
It's a massive structural shift. The old model dictated that leaders gain trust by demonstrating expertise, intellectual consistency, dignity, and adhering to established norms.
The old way of doing things.
The old way. Now, the new basis for trust operates entirely differently. Leaders gain trust primarily by attacking the very same institutions their supporters have already lost faith in.
So you bond over a shared enemy.
That's it. It is, in effect, bonding through shared opposition rather than shared values.
That is a critical insight, and it explains why a traditional resume, consistency, or even what we used to call integrity, have become almost irrelevant factors in modern leadership.
It's the ultimate symptom of the breakdown. And it means that if Trump successfully consolidates power, he will operate in an environment where traditional credibility, norms, and precedents are not seen as necessary guardrails, but as obstacles to be intentionally dismantled.
So disruption becomes the goal.
Disruption is valued, it's applauded, and it's rewarded over careful, deliberative process. For you, the listener, this means understanding that the stability of the past is not coming back. We are entering an era where consensus is dead and disruption is the most powerful tool available. So the massive shifts we've outlined, this collapse of trust across all sectors, the existential economic pain points, and the aggressive political realignment, they all contribute to one undeniable outcome. They create an opening for something fundamentally new in American life.
And as we've discussed, that something new isn't guaranteed to be better or worse, is it? It simply means that the old, institution-dependent model is unsustainable. It's actively ending right now.
Correct. And the analysis, it attempts to provide some actionable guidance for you, the learner, who's trying to navigate this period of intense uncertainty. So we can look at the implications in the short, medium, and long term.
Okay, let's start with the short term. Volatility seems like a foregone conclusion, given the nature of the disruption strategy we've been talking about.
Absolutely. Markets are inherently conservative. They hate uncertainty and disruption. Trump's stated approach, using tariffs aggressively, challenging the established trade regime, and maintaining an atmosphere of constant political tension, is specifically designed to create uncertainty in order to gain leverage.
So what's the advice?
The sources advise you to be highly attentive to shifts in policy and rhetoric, but, and this is important, they caution against panicking. Understand that volatility in the coming years is not an accident. It is the natural, intended consequence of a governing and political strategy built around disruption.
And the medium-term forecast. That focuses on the deepening political realignment, moving past the tired Democrat versus Republican divide.
Yeah, the old lines are dissolving faster than ever. The core conflict is shifting decisively toward establishment versus populist and insider versus outsider.
And that cuts across traditional party lines.
It does. You now see wealthy, highly educated professionals abandoning the Democratic Party over certain cultural issues, while longtime union workers are gravitating toward the Republican Party due to economic nationalist policies. The political calculus you've used your whole life is changing rapidly.
So you can't just vote the party line anymore and assume it represents you.
No. You can no longer safely assume the party you vote for represents your interests in the same way it did even a decade ago. Every election cycle will require a complete reevaluation of candidates based on where they stand in this new insider-outsider divide.
This leads us to the most profound observation in the sources. The fundamental, long-term restructuring of American life, based on the end of several post-war promises that really define decades of prosperity and security.
This is the core structural shift that you, the listener, must adapt to. First, the promise that a college degree and a stable corporate career equates to financial security is, quote, definitively over for most people.
That's a huge statement.
It is. The analysis points to the crushing burden of student debt, coupled with the instability of modern corporate employment, where loyalty is non-existent and layoffs are perpetually imminent. This path has become financially toxic for a huge segment of the population.
And what about the most sacred promises of all government-funded retirement?
Yes, the promise of Social Security and Medicare is under severe structural strain. The sources reiterate what we know: demographic shifts. Fewer workers supporting more retirees mean that the existing funding mechanism is mathematically unsustainable without drastic changes.
And politicians always promise to protect them.
They do, but the economic reality is that these systems will require significant restructuring, or the benefits will be profoundly diluted in real purchasing power over the next decade.
And finally, the foundational belief in the American dream itself.
The belief that if you simply work hard, save, and follow the rules laid out by the establishment, success is guaranteed. That foundational trust is gone. Millions of Americans feel they did follow all the rules, yet they find themselves perpetually insecure, stuck in unaffordable housing markets, and facing retirement savings that don't match the promises they were sold.
So if this hyper-individualized, institution-dependent path to security is closing, what model is the analysis suggesting is coming into focus? What replaces it?
The source material suggests a slow shift toward models that are potentially more locally resilient, even if they appear more chaotic from the top down. We may be seeing a return to models that rely on community strength rather than institutional guarantees.
What does that look like in practice?
Think more people starting small, resilient businesses or embracing vocational training instead of just chasing corporate ladders. Think communities creating local, redundant support systems for healthcare or childcare, rather than relying solely on centralized federal or state programs.
And what else?
And crucially, a likely return to more widespread, multi-generational living arrangements. Grandparents living with children and grandchildren, not out of choice, but out of sheer necessity for shared economic and logistical resilience.
That sounds like a powerful societal contraction, a return to older, more, almost tribal patterns of living that are fundamentally more resilient against large-scale economic shock.
That's the interpretation. The analysis views Trump not as the cause of this shift, but as the loudest symptom and the most potent accelerant of it. His strategy gains power precisely because the hyper-individualized, institution-dependent model that characterized the last several decades was simply never going to be sustainable for the majority of the population. We are currently in the messy, disruptive transition period where that old consensus is collapsing, and your ability to navigate this period hinges on recognizing and adapting to these new models of resilience.
So this deep dive has confirmed that Trump's recent announcement, the loyalty purge, the swift economic pivot, is far more than just a headline. It's a strategically engineered mirror, and it's reflecting America's deepest fears, its core economic values, and the kind of high-stakes disruption it might be willing to endure to achieve some sense of stability.
We are undoubtedly standing at a turning point. It's one of those moments where politics, economics, technology, and culture are all intersecting and colliding in ways that truly only happen a few times across multiple generations. The rules of engagement are being rewritten in real time.
The good news, and I think this is the most important takeaway for you, the listener, is that you already possess the most critical skill needed for this volatile era, and that is the ability to adapt. You have lived through major structural changes already: technological shifts, global financial crises, and institutional failures. This next wave of restructuring is coming, whether we are ready for it or not.
Therefore, the emphasis has to shift from institutional reliance to self-reliance. It means staying intensely curious, maintaining your critical faculties by questioning the motives of all sources, and staying deeply connected to your local communities. Do not let the intentional chaos overwhelm your judgment, and most importantly, do not let others, whether they are political leaders or media experts, dictate your thinking.
The final provocative thought for you to take away is this: when every leader, regardless of their party, has proven they are willing to strategically weaponize morality on chaos for leverage, your only true safety net is your own informed skepticism.
Hold every leader accountable, regardless of whether you agree with them politically. Demand specifics and ask the tough, practical questions. Will the plans being proposed genuinely help or hurt the financial and social stability of regular working Americans who simply want to retire with some dignity?
Because the conversation about the true future of work, wealth, and community resilience isn't ending here with a political spectacle. It is simply beginning. And your informed, critical perspective, honed by years of adaptation, is the most valuable asset you have right now?